Good morning or afternoon, everybody. We'll just wait another minute or two until other people arrive. Some people might be coming a little bit late, and then we'll make a start. Before we begin, could I just ask everybody to rename themselves, so that we know not just who you are, but kind of where you're from as well, which overseas country or territory you're from, or which organization you're from if you're not from one of the OCTs or OTs. It just makes it a bit easier to get a sense of exactly who everybody is. Okay, well, I think most people have probably arrived now. Welcome to the second of the two Green Overseas trainings on institutional frameworks and looking at how institutional mechanisms can foster mainstream of climate resilience. This is the second of five trainings that we're going to be doing, organised by the GO team. Before we begin and before we move into the kind of substantive discussion of today's agenda, I'm going to pass over to Lena from the GO team, who's going to give just a bit of background on the Green Overseas programme and why these trainings are so important and how they fit into that agenda. Over to you, Lena.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to this second out of five online trainings that we're organizing in the framework of the Green Overseas Climate Change Resilience Community. This series of online trainings is on climate change resilience mainstreaming. And so we already convened on Monday for many of you and us who are connected today, but not all of us. So some are joining only today. On Monday, we were speaking about policy frameworks at different levels about climate change adaptation and resilience, and different incentives and opportunities for OCTs. And we're looking very forward now to dig deeper into this second session before we convene again next week with the three other sessions of the online training. So just as Matt just earlier said, we would kindly like to invite you to rename yourselves on the Zoom interface to indicate the overseas country and territory that you're coming from, and then your name, of course, so that we get a better view altogether of who is connected to this online training. And so I will not make it much longer. I'm here in case you have any questions about the Green Overseas program, our different communities. But for now, I would really like to give the floor to Matt Bishop, who will be our trainer today for this second session of our online training series on climate change resilience. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lena. So we're going to start now by doing some introductory activities using the Mentimeter tool in a moment. Before we get to that, I thought I should introduce myself. So my name's Matt Bishop. I'm an academic based in the UK, but I'm also one of the co-directors of the Resilient and Sustainable Islands Initiative, which is based at ODI in London, the Overseas Development Institute. And we're a global advisory network that does a whole range of activities related to small island development broadly writ large. And so we've been working closely with Ramboll, a large French consultancy company, to organise and essentially create the materials for this work stream and the other two work streams of the resilience programme. So some of that work will become clearer as today's session goes on, because I'm going to be presenting some of the kind of work we've been doing behind the scenes in order to consolidate and synthesize data on resilience mainstreaming within the OCTs and UK overseas territories. So as Lena suggested, there are 5 sessions in the trainings over the next couple of weeks. We did the first one a few days ago. This second one, as I said, is essentially looking at levers, ways in which we can foster the mainstreaming of climate resilience in sectoral policies within the territories. And then this builds on, this kind of informs the broader unfolding of the sessions over the next couple of weeks, thinking about how we identify stakeholders in the next session, looking at collaboration strategies in the subsequent one, and then finally thinking about monitoring and evaluation at the end. There are a number of different objectives, both for the sessions as a whole and also for today's session specifically. And one thing that I think we mentioned last time, but if you weren't here, you might not be aware of it, is that the training sessions are being repeated twice, essentially. So we're doing these ones now in English. This exact same session will also be run by the Ramboll team later on this evening, European time. Broadly, but not exclusively, for a Pacific audience, they'll be doing that one in French. So even though not every OCT is probably represented in this particular group, across the trainings that we do, pretty much everyone will be represented in some way. So there are 3 broad objectives for the 5 training sessions as a whole. One of them is to develop and share a common language, in turn laying the foundations for what we've called a common culture on climate change adaptation in OCT. So this is partly about synthesizing existing knowledge on the subject and presenting that to you in a way that you can engage with. But it's also about encouraging reflection on the distinctive challenges that those of you working in OCTs face when dealing with these kind of quite significant policy agendas. The second one is to help you gain the tools or the keys to identify both the barriers inhibiting resilience mainstreaming, and also the levers by which you may be able to push that process forward and generate greater climate resilience and adaptation activity. And then the third one is to understand and have a really good grasp of the main components that help you to progress towards resilience mainstreaming in sectoral policies and regulations. So in plain English, this really means how can you find ways to make sure that resilience mainstreaming agendas become broadly embedded across the different sectors of your economy and society and polity. The objectives of today's session specifically are focused to some extent on the first 2 of those wider objectives. So the one thing we're going to do is consolidate some of the literature on mainstreaming, on adaptation mainstreaming, and think about how institutions can support mainstreaming. One thing that I think you're going to see when we present some of this information is that there's quite a lot of talk in the literature, particularly the academic literature, on the barriers to mainstreaming. And that is important because there are definitely challenges that societies face in engaging in mainstreaming activity. But we also want to get you thinking about levers as well. So think about opportunities as much as constraints. The second thing we're going to do is present some key findings on some of the things that we've discovered by doing quite a substantial desk review of policies and other documents, laws, other literatures that emanate from your territories. Over the past 2 months, the team from ODI, so myself, my colleague Courtney Lindsay and Emily Wilkinson, and also the Ramboll team, in particular Sandrine and Leticia, who I think are on the call, we've undertaken quite a significant desk review of the available kind of primary literature, if you like, on the territories as a whole. We've reviewed dozens, probably over 100 documents. So these are things like, climate plans, things like existing legal mechanisms. We've been through the websites of ministries. And what we've tried to do is consolidate as much information as we possibly can on the state of play when it comes to climate resilience, environmental policy, and mainstreaming activity in the OCTs as a whole. So I'm going to spend some time in due course presenting the way we did that activity, and what we think we've learned from it. Now, there are two points to that objective, really. One is to kind of get a sense check from all of you in terms of whether we're right. Have we missed things? Are there gaps in our understanding of what's going on? Are some of the analytical insights that we make about the existing state of play problematic? Are there things that we should know about? Are there reports that we might have missed, and so on? And then the other important objective there is to get you to start thinking about where your territories lie in relation to the kind of frameworks that we use to understand the process of adaptation and mainstreaming, adaptation mainstreaming, resilience mainstreaming. And we're going to present some information there to get you to start thinking about, well, how far have we got? Where are the gaps in the actual practice that is occurring in our territories, and so on? And what are the barriers along the policy cycle, as we call it, to that occurring? And then the final part of the session, we're going to look at what we call the QGS tool, the Quick Governance Scan tool. So colleagues at Ramboll, Leticia in particular, are developing a tool that we're going to roll out over the course of the Green Overseas programme, so the subsequent 2 work streams, that hopefully should be really, really helpful for all of you to then deploy in terms of your actual everyday practice when it comes to trying to move forward adaptation and mainstreaming agendas. So we're going to give you some kind of initial early view of how that is developing, really, and again get your sense of what that looks like, and hopefully get some feedback on it, and continue the dialogue in that area. So I hope that makes sense to everybody. Feel free to interject at any point with questions, or put a hand up if you want to ask something or say something or put something in the chat. What we'll do now is we'll move on to Mentimeter. We've got some kind of simple introductory tasks to do here, and what we're going to do is look at we've got the Mentimeter app embedded in Zoom now, so I'm going to invite everybody on the call to join the Mentimeter chat. And we've got an icebreaker activity here. You should all be able to see this now inside Zoom, so you don't need to log on with your phones unless you want to. You should be able to see a thing that allows you to enter your own responses directly through Zoom. But if not, you can do it by scanning the QR code. We've just got some really kind of overarching questions to get a sense of who's on the call, where you're all from, and that kind of thing. So the first one, simple question, where are you from? That's fantastic. So I think most people have responded. So we've got huge numbers of territories well represented in the room, which is great to see. Majority of people, or the largest numbers of people, seem to be from Turks and Caicos, St. Martin, Curacao, and Bermuda, which is really, really interesting. But everyone seems to be represented reasonably well, which is great. A nice diversity of representation, which is terrific. The next question: were you able to attend the first training session? So it'd be good for us to know who was here a few days ago and who wasn't. Okay, great, fantastic. So it looks like most people were here on Monday, which is great to see, and it's great that you've all come back. So that suggests that the training was well pitched. So we're pleased about that for sure. What is your job? What's your role? What do you do within that role? Great. So we've got a real diversity of job roles here. Some people are focal points within government, some people work in finance, a number of people seem to work in policy, people, I guess, that work at different levels, some research, communications. So that's really interesting. So we've got a really diverse set of kind of experiences here that people hopefully can share from. And we're very keen for this to be as interactive as possible. Okay, fantastic. So that's the Mentimeter session done for now. We'll move back to the presentation. So as I said just now, we're going to spend a bit of time doing the introduction to the adaptation process cycle. And this is to some extent, fairly theoretical discussion, but I'll try not to labor it too much. Then we're going to move on to the screening exercise and report back on that. And then we'll do the QGS tool at the end. So thinking about resilience and thinking about the adaptation process, there are a number of key frameworks that are available within the kind of academic and policy literature that address this. All of them, to some extent, are based on this kind of process, policy process cycle. So if you look at the diagram that's on the right-hand side of the screen there, they essentially unfold, and this is probably self-explanatory really, through a series of phases. So the process itself has a series of phases. There's kind of a definitional exploratory phase at the beginning. There's an assessment phase that follows that. So what are the patterns of vulnerability that exist within a particular territory? There's a definitional stage that then follows that, which is where you would tease out a kind of adaptation framework and the strategies by which you seek to address it. And then there'll be an implementation phase that comes at the end, and that would include the monitoring and the evaluation of ongoing progress within the adaptation process as it unfolds. Now, one of the things that becomes quite clear in much of the literature on adaptation is that a key problem that is identified throughout is that there are barriers to this process occurring. There are reasons why this does not go as smoothly as it seems. Sometimes places get stuck in terms of trying to implement policy. They get stuck in terms of at the definitional stage, and as I'm sure you can imagine, there are a whole host of things that can potentially inhibit that. So, you know, early on there might be data gaps that you have, that you can't actually define adequately the problems that you're trying to deal with. Later on, there might be other problems such as kind of turf wars between different parts of the government or other agencies and so on. So all along the way throughout this process, there are barriers, and I'll come back to them in a moment. But the key kind of introductory point to make is that resilience and adaptation are not really endpoints. In kind of theory, a system could adapt fully to a particular context that it faces. You could build complete resilience to any of the shocks or threats that you face, or you could adapt to a change in your environment completely and move on. But in practice, those end states are not really reached. These are ongoing processes almost by definition. And I think that becomes kind of fairly obvious when you think about the nature of climate change, right? Climate change, and by implication, all of the other environmental shifts that we see that are connected to it, are themselves ongoing processes. They're things that potentially get worse or better, maybe, over time. They're things that carry with them consequences whenever a particular change worsens to a particular point. So if we think of these things as ongoing processes, if we think of the kind of the context that territories face in grappling with environmental shifts as an ongoing process, by definition, the strategies that you employ in order to adapt to those processes are themselves ongoing processes as well. So as social and ecological systems change and are constantly changing, this means that the context that actors such as yourselves working in government or working in other stakeholder organizations within territories, the context in which you work is one that is changing as well. So the context in which you are seeking to govern and manage responses to those ecological and environmental changes are necessarily dynamic. So the measures that you have to employ are also dynamic as well. So this is a dynamic, ongoing, evolving context that we're grappling with. But at the same time, the adaptation activity that you employ occurs on a spectrum with a whole set of different kind of objectives or criteria. And I would suggest, although people don't have to agree, that these become progressively more difficult to realise over time. So one of the things that we'll talk about a bit when we get to the screening is that by and large, most of the OTs and OCTs have managed to do quite a lot of the work that is required at phase 1 and phase 2, to some extent phase 3, as it's presented in this diagram here. But where they seem to have struggled a bit more is moving on from phase 3 and into phase 4. So societies in general are very, very good at defining the problem. They can do the studies that are required, often to create environmental plans and that kind of thing. But the further along they get towards implementation, things become much, much more difficult. And we're really, really keen to hear from you about whether that chimes with your experience, and also whether or not, what the reasons for that might be. So the key takeaway from this first slide really is that just resilience and adaptation mainstreaming is by definition an ongoing process. It's something that has to continually respond to a context outside that is also changing quite rapidly, quite often. And there are a whole series of scientific frameworks that have been proposed to kind of identify the barriers to successful mainstreaming, and then by implication to overcome them. And I don't intend to go into any great detail here, other than to suggest that it's not difficult to find reading on any of these if you are interested and want to read more about them. The policy cycle approach is the kind of conventional way of thinking about these issues, and that's what corresponds to the diagram I showed you on the last slide. And this is useful for decision makers because it's simple. It's simple to conceive of the policy process as having these kind of neat stages. Sometimes you'll see them presented as more than 4 stages. Sometimes you'll see them presented as 4, or sometimes even fewer. And particularly if you're not just looking at climate adaptation, if you're looking at other policy cycles elsewhere that we might think of. But the point is that it makes sense, right? You start off with definitions and then you move through all these different stages via implementation to monitoring. I mean, it's common sense really, isn't it? And this is a useful way of thinking because it is so simple. But the problem with it is that it potentially just describes what the ideal process looks like. It doesn't guide it necessarily. It doesn't tell us what you need to do at each of those stages beyond the activities that you should supposedly do. It doesn't tell you how to do them. It doesn't tell you how to deal with problems that you face when doing them. It doesn't explain why you encounter challenges when you're seeking to do those things. So we need something that's a bit more analytical. So you need a framework that has components of a kind of idealized rational approach, but it also needs to embody within it a series of systematic questions. So how do actors behave within that process? What is the context within which they're behaving, both in terms of the specific climate or environmental challenges that their territory faces, within, what is their kind of position within the governing systems that they're functioning within? What do they have in terms of resources in order to engage in policy development or implementation activity? And what does the system itself, how does the system itself influence the challenges they face or the barriers they face to moving forward with that implementative activity? Another approach, another way of thinking about this is to identify the mechanisms that lead to dead ends, right? So this is kind of a structural approach to thinking about these questions. So why is it that within some systems, proponents of adaptation or mainstreaming activity are unable to get their ideas or their policies or their agendas through? Is there conflict that's happening within the bureaucracy? Are there what are sometimes called innovation risk paradoxes? Is the cost of actually engaging in transformative policy perceived to be, greater than the benefits that it might generate? There's a whole literature on the problem with these kind of mechanisms. Turf wars, I mentioned this earlier, turf wars between ministries are something that is often identified, particularly in research on larger countries. Now, one of the problems here, I suppose, is that I'm not personally convinced, again, people can disagree, that these are necessarily the problems that afflict many small non-sovereign territories like the OCTs and the UK OTs. It's not obvious to me, actually, that turf wars are necessarily the major problem in explaining why adaptation struggles. I wonder, actually, if the explanation is much more to do with a lack of resources or relative lack of human expertise and so on, other kinds of constraints. But this is something that we can talk about as we go forward. A third approach moves on from mechanisms and thinks more about institutions. So what are the prevailing institutions within a given governing context? What's the nature of the regulatory apparatus? Do we have the right regulations that we need in order to push mainstreaming forward? What are the structural kind of constraints that exist? Are there sort of historical factors, or does the shape of the kind of bureaucracy inhibit the right ways of doing things? Do we even have the necessary ministries or departments that can do this kinds of work? Do we have the right kind of behaviors? Do we have the right cultures? Are there contextual problems? Do we have the right human capital? Do we have sufficient resources as well? There's a whole, what are the norms around adaptation and mainstreaming? How do people collectively understand and think about environmental questions? This institutional approach sees those institutions as decisively either enabling or constraining or shaping adaptation policies and actions, and that's become quite a preeminent way of thinking about these issues. And there's something also called the governance capabilities approach, which points out questions of kind of reflexivity, responsiveness, resilience, revitalization, and rescaling. All complex words that essentially mean that all kind of societies have particular capacities in terms of their governance in order to be able to generate particular kinds of adaptive transitions. So broadly speaking, there's a lot going on here potentially, but we kind of distill these insights from different literatures or different ways of thinking about overcoming barriers or about kind of constraints on adaptation, and suggest that we need a tool that takes us some way beyond the policy cycle approach alone, but it creates a framework, or it is based on a framework that draws on some of the key important insights from those different literatures to do 4 broad things. The first one is that the tool has to be sophisticated. So it has to offer analysis. It has to guide the process of mainstreaming. It has to do more than just describe the different stages of mainstreaming, but it also has to be simple and usable. It can't be too complicated. The second is that it has to take account of both institutional barriers, so all of the things I talked about just now that potentially constrain adaptation, but also has to focus on the levers or the opportunities. I said this at the beginning of the session. It has to be positive as well as negative. It has to be able to say, well, how can those barriers be overcome, or what are the distinctive characteristics of a particular society or territory or its governing system that actually mean it has real advantages in terms of pushing forward mainstreaming. So to bring this to life, one example that we can come back to in the next part of the discussion is to do with small size. So one of the conventional kind of understandings of very small territories is that they don't have sufficient capacity always to be able to conceptualize environmental agendas, create the necessary laws and policy, and then push them forward through implementative institutions. From the screening activity that we did, that I'll talk about in a bit more detail later, actually, that doesn't always seem to be the case. In some of the very smallest territories, that relative lack of evident capacity could be seen as an advantage in some cases, because the very smallness allows them, it seems, to identify very, very clear sources of expertise, even if that expertise is limited, and kind of consolidate it in really, really nimble institutions that can actually function as kind of committees or other kinds of institutional bodies that can actually move forward quite quickly. They don't necessarily have to have the paraphernalia that a much more well-resourced bureaucracy might have. So smallness can carry opportunities as well as represent constraints, just as any other characteristic of a given society or territory can as well. The third dimension of the tool, or the third requirement of the tool, is that it should be able to guide action on the part of key agents. So it should help actors like yourselves determine what they should do in a given context, how they can overcome a barrier, and how they can use the levers at their disposal in order to move forward a given agenda. And then the final point is that it should be sensitive to the distinctive overseas country and territory, or UK overseas territory context. And this is something that I think is quite important, right? As I said just now, it's not always obvious to me that the kind of conventional debates in much of the literature about some of the problems with adaptation mainstreaming, or indeed any other aspects of small island governance, and I realise not all of the territories are small islands, but many are. It seems to me that sometimes the assumptions in those literatures, because they're distilled usually from the experience of bigger countries, independent states, they don't always travel very well. They don't always identify the same barriers that people such as yourselves might identify in terms of your own work in this area. So that's just a little bit of an overview of kind of the existing frameworks, if you like, for thinking about barriers to adaptation. We'll move on now to think about the mainstreaming framework that we've deployed in our team with the work that we're doing here. And essentially what you can see in the middle of this diagram that Leticia did a great job in designing is that essentially you've got the kind of 4 dimensions of the policy process cycle in the middle that we talked about just now. So they're essentially the same as what was on the diagram 2 or 3 slides ago. And then we've broken these down further into a series of sub-criteria, if you like. So on step 1, when you're preparing the ground for action, we've divided these up into 2 distinct elements. So one of these is the policy frameworks and the policy coherence for adaptation and mainstreaming, and also leadership and institutional capacity. So who leads these initiatives and agendas? And one thing that you might be surprised about is that in different territories, they have very, very different mechanisms and ways of doing this, or at least it appears to be from the review that we've undertaken. Then at step 2, identifying the problem and defining needs, we think there are 2 things that potentially need to occur here. One is thinking about the necessary climate information and tools at your disposal. So what data do you have? What information are you able to gather? What organizations do you have working in or on your territory that are providing research and analysis and so on to feed into those processes? And then there's a more kind of bottom-up set of knowledge that we think is really important as well. So thinking about community engagement, stakeholder inclusion, and so on. So whose voices get heard in this process, who gets to define what the needs are. And I think it's quite significant that that particular component is placed at step 2 rather than where it sometimes is placed at step 4. So seeing kind of civil society and the wider community as active participants in the process rather than people who are just sort of consulted at the end of the process, if that makes sense. Step 3, developing, assessing and implementing the options. So there are 2 things here that we think are important. One is the coordination mechanisms that are able to kind of guide action. And again, I think the OCTs and OTs have quite significant diversity here in terms of the structures that they've established, or in some cases not established, in order to guide action. In some cases, they've kind of piggybacked on existing structures and institutions, usually within the kind of core of their executive. So the very top of government, so that would be kind of the governor or the premier, depending on the territory, or both of them. And others have actually created entirely new committees, or they've signalled an intention to create new committees to do that sort of work. And then we've got a question around supportive human and financial resources. So how much is invested, both in terms of people's time and expertise, but also money into these processes, and how are the investments that a territory needs to make identified, who gets to identify them, and how do they prioritize investments in a context, as ever, of kind of finite resources. And then the final one, that step 4, is thinking about adaptive management capabilities. So how do you move not simply to a place where adaptation is well mainstreamed, but that continues to be, that adaptive process becomes embedded within systems, so it continues in an ongoing way to support ongoing adaptation. So this is the framework that we've broadly applied to the screening that we've done. These are the components and criteria that we've utilised, which I'll present in a moment. But before we do that, we're going to have another quick Menti and just get a sense of where people stand on some of these questions, and how you feel about some of the kind of things that we've raised. So I'm going to open the app again, and then we'll get a sense of where you sit on these adaptation frameworks. Can everybody see that? Okay. So you have the option of scanning the QR code again, or you should be able to just do this on the app itself, hopefully. Okay. So the first question. Among the following elements, which are the biggest constraints on successful adaptation in your own context? Feel free to take a moment to think about it. Okay, so we seem to have probably not a consensus, because people seem to think quite different things are important here. But there is a sense that coordination mechanisms are perhaps less of a worry than community engagement and community engagement, which I think is quite interesting. So that potentially implies that either community engagement's not seen to be important, or actually you think that community engagement is generally undertaken in a pretty good way for the most part in your territories. And maybe the same is true of the kind of mechanisms that you have to coordinate. But in all of them, it seems the policy context is potentially a problem, which is quite interesting for me, I think, having done the screening exercise, because something that we'll talk about in a moment is that this is also the area where many OTs seem to be doing really, really well. Institutional capacity leadership, potentially a problem as well. That potentially could spill over, I guess, into coordination mechanisms too. Data seems to be a significant gap, human capacity, and obviously finance as well. I just wonder if at this point, if anybody would like to come in and just share some experiences or give us some thoughts on their reasons for choosing particular elements here. Has anybody got anything burning they'd like to say about the constraints facing adaptation in your territories? No? Okay, there's no pressure. There'll be other opportunities for people to talk as we move on, so that's fine. Okay, so the next question, what is the one thing that would improve the adaptation process in your territory? Is that working for people, or are people just thinking still? Okay, good. Thanks, Gail. Okay, this is fantastic. So we've got almost an entire set of different responses here. So access to expertise and sharing expertise with other territories. So this is a key dimension of what the Green Overseas Resilience Programme is aiming to achieve. So sharing the experiences of others. And again, one of the things we'll talk about in a moment on the screening is where we as a kind of analytical team think that there are kind of examples of strong practice that could be shared across the community as a whole. Better coordination, a couple of people have said this, better coordination across ministries and departments, better leadership of that coordination, which I think is interesting given that only one person, I think, said that coordination mechanisms were the main or a significant problem on the previous Menti, which is intriguing. Continuity is a significant problem. One of the things, again, that I think we identified in the screening is that the territories seem to have kind of bursts of activity where for a period of time environmental policy will be prioritized, it seems, and then it might go onto the back burner for a bit. And one of the questions I think we've got for all of you is, well, what explains that? Is that simply because of changes in government? Is it because of other perceived crises take effect? I wonder whether the COVID-19 pandemic has put a lot of environmental policy making on the back burner in some territories, or is it something else? So problems and continuity are an evident challenge. Is it a question of strong political will and leadership, or is it something else? Commitment to following through on policy development and updating. I mean, that seems really important as well. Again, is that a question of a lack of significant or sufficient? Is it about insufficient human capital and expertise? You know, are there enough people in some territories to draft the necessary legislation, for example, that would give effect to the policies that have been designed? Why is there, a few people have said political will, why is there a lack of political will? Why doesn't that exist? Why, you know, can it just be attributed quite simply to political leaders or politicians, or is there something else going on? Are they responding to other kinds of incentives? Increased structural human capacity, so not project-based. Yeah, this is a lament that we hear all the time to do with all elements of policy making in many small territories. It's a significant problem that much of the expertise, particularly if it comes in from outside, tends to be hired on a project basis rather than a more kind of sustained, ongoing, programmatic sort of basis. So that has other problems. It feeds into this question of lack of expertise that someone's mentioned. Also kind of continuity and churn in leadership, and I presume that means leadership within institutions as well as just leadership at the kind of top level. Believing in climate change, that's a really, really interesting one. I find that very intriguing that there might be people that at this stage don't think that climate change is very significant, particularly those, you know, those that come from small island, low-lying island territories. Fear of taking difficult or unpopular decisions. Yeah, I mean, that's a problem, isn't it? You know, where you've got vested interests that have to be faced down and so on. That's really, really helpful for us. There's some fantastic insights that people have given there. Again, this is an opportunity. Would anybody like to come in and talk about some of the things they've mentioned here? Would anybody like to expand on them or share any experiences? again, there's no pressure on anybody to talk. You're more than welcome to put something in the chat as well if you'd like to. No? Okay. Well, we can carry on. Thanks a lot for that, everybody. That was a fantastic set of insights there. Okay, we'll go back to the slides now. So what I'll do now is I'll talk about the presentation of the tool, the screening that we did. My colleague Courtney is on the call here. I don't know if you just want to come in, Courtney, and introduce yourself, given that you were instrumental to doing this as well.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm in a bit of a noisy environment here at a hotel in DC. Yes, I'm Courtney, a senior research officer with ODI. So we're working with Ramble on this project. So I'm just supporting Matt and Emily, who unfortunately is on bereavement leave, so she's unable to be involved. So yes, so where I had come in was on the screening aspect of it. So we each looked at all the OCTs of the UK and France, just to look at certain aspects of how adaptation is being not well kind of carried out in these countries. Like what are the ministries doing? Well, do they even have ministries devoted to climate adaptation and resilience? And mainly just looking at the different policies that they have in place, and how these policies are aligned with other policies that are basically doing the same thing. Are there authority departments that are developed to enforce, the implementation and the rules that these policies and regulations have set environmental wise? So it was a very interesting piece of work that we did that has now fed into this, and it allowed us to identify a lot of the deficiencies that Matt is now explaining. So it's getting even noisier. So back over to you, Matt, in case no one can hear.
Great. Thanks, Courtney. That's fantastic. Before we move on, Matt from the Falkland Islands government has just suggested something that he's grappling with. He says he's pretty new to the territory, but key challenges they seem to face are logistical and generating confidence and buy-in that policies that they're developing are based on trying to enhance resilience and not just being difficult. Some key challenges include differing perspectives from policymakers thinking very long-term versus community stakeholders who face very real, significant short-term challenges and constraints. That then leads to questions around overcoming opportunity costs. It'd be very interesting to hear if other people have had similar experiences, because it seems to me that the kinds of policy that you're trying to implement when you're doing adaptive transformations necessarily rub up against existing ways of doing things, existing kind of patterns of vested interest, or existing kind of cultural, kind of well-embedded cultural ways of doing things. And as a consequence of that, it can be seen to be quite difficult. People give pushback against those kinds of things, even though the kind of agenda that you're trying to implement is one that has quite significant longer term benefits potentially. Would anybody like to add anything to this before we move on?
Certainly.
Oh, thank you. Can you introduce yourself as well, if that's okay?
I'm John Penn from the Ministry of Finance at the Virgin Islands government. One of the things also concerning this matter is if people do not buy into the process of buying into, for instance, climate change, then you would have a lot of resistance. And as such, that's it's very important that we get the stakeholders to buy in. And I think that would be my contribution.
How do you do that, John? If you don't mind me coming back to you on that, how do you achieve that level of buy-in? How do you go about doing that?
Well, first by educating the public, for instance, in the territories, you'll have to educate them, do a lot more public service announcements and so on, so that they could understand, because when people don't understand, they don't buy in.
Yeah, so there's an educational dimension to this for sure. Does anybody else have any reflections they'd like to offer on this question? No? Okay, well, we can move on. This is something I'm sure we'll come back to as the rest of the session unfolds. Okay, so as Courtney suggested, we screened a huge number of documents for the synthesis process that we went through. Courtney and I divided up essentially the UK OTs between us. So he did the screening of the non-Caribbean UK OTs. I did the Caribbean ones, and then the Ramboll team, Laetitia and Sandrine, who will be presenting this to the second session in French later on. They did the French territories and mainly the Pacific, but not exclusively, and also the Dutch territories as well. And I think we reviewed at least 100 documents. It's difficult to keep track. And there were a huge number of different types of documents as well. So, and this obviously varied quite significantly across territories, because different territories have produced different kinds of documents over different timeframes. So there were laws and acts pertaining to all manner of different kinds of environmental legislation and so on. There were economic development plans, sectoral development plans, economic development strategies. There were climate change policies, there were biodiversity strategies, there were, as you can see there from the TCI, the natural capital accounting review, climate change adaptation policies, all manner of different policy documents that were kind of analogous in different territories, but they, as I said, they've all got different things that they have and haven't done. We looked on ministry websites, because these were often good places where there was a kind of consolidated repository of existing laws pertaining to energy, to biodiversity, to all manner of different kind of environmental phenomena, coastal protection, and so on. And I think we, or at least we believe, that we just about gathered everything of relevance that there is to gather in terms of these important documents on the territories as a whole, in order to develop this snapshot of resilience mainstreaming in them. So the study had 4 broad objectives. One was to understand the extent of progress across the territories in terms of mainstreaming. The second one was to grasp how that progress relates to different dimensions of the policy cycle. So the diagrams that I've presented to you already, that have these different stages of the adaptation policy process. How well are territories doing, at least as we can see from the publicly available information, according to these different parts of the process, and underneath them were sub-criteria that we kind of assessed them against. The third objective was to make what we've called here initial comparative assessments of progress within and between territories over time. And I think that's really, really important. The over time aspect matters, because some territories have made significant amounts of progress at certain periods, and then, as I said, sometimes it's gone to the back burner, or for some of them, progress has been very recent. And it seems to me quite an interesting question to ask. Well, why is that the case? Is it about political will, as some of you suggested on the Mentimeter activity just now, or is it about something else? And then the fourth objective was to identify areas of particularly strong practice that can help to ascertain gaps in resilience building while informing lesson sharing. And broadly speaking, as I think I said earlier, most territories are doing quite well at the early stages of the policy cycle. Most territories are probably doing less well, I think it's fair to say, the further along the cycle you get towards the evaluation end. Now, that could just be because of the timeframes over which this occurs, right? This is still for many a relatively new agenda. So almost by definition, it might be the case that you haven't got to the end of the cycle yet. But I think it's probably also the case that the activities that are required early on are quite difficult, they're quite time consuming, they require resources, they require expertise, and they require significant investments. And it almost stands to reason that the further along the cycle you get, things potentially get a bit more difficult. But one other thing we identified from the process, which was really, really interesting, is that no territory was perfect on all of the indicators we looked at, and different territories seem to have different strengths, or different territories have done things well. So when we talk about identifying areas of particularly strong practice, it was actually quite easy to identify particular territories that have done a good job in particular areas, and it wasn't just the same territories appearing all the time in that. So I think that tells us something quite interesting, that this isn't, the process itself, although we've suggested it's kind of linear, moving through these discrete stages, it isn't always linear, and some territories, are doing really, really well in terms of things that we might think come later on in the process, and so on. So we looked at 7 dimensions, and these are the things that I presented to you earlier: policy frameworks and policy coherence, leadership and institutional capacity, the coordination mechanisms, climate information and tools, human and financial resources, stakeholder engagement, and monitoring and adaptation for adaptive planning. And what I'm going to do is just very, very briefly talk you through the different things that we discovered as we did the activity, and try and tease out some of the insights. So I'll start with the first one. Well, before I do that, I'll show you the matrix that we've got. Please don't try and read that. It's impossible to read. But this is a screenshot of the spreadsheet that we used to consolidate the screening information. So essentially what we did is we read all of these reports that we'd gathered, which was quite a time-consuming job, as you can imagine. And then we inserted into this matrix all of the interesting things that we'd found. So this only shows probably about half of the territories because I couldn't get a big enough screenshot. But the coloured squares along the top are the different dimensions of the process. So the 7 dimensions that I just mentioned, color coded along the top, broken down into their criteria. And then on the left, each row is a territory. And what we've got for some territories, as you can see, is quite a lot of text. And what that means is that we found essentially lots of documentation, and we were able to synthesize and distill from that interesting insights about what different territories are doing. You'll notice the further right you go on the spreadsheet, there are more and more yellow boxes. And if you could go all the way down, which you can't, to look at all of the territories, on these kind of criteria towards the end, towards the monitoring and evaluation activity, there are more and more yellow boxes. And what that means is that we couldn't find anything. There was no published information, or little useful published information. And you'll see that some of the boxes also don't have much text in them the further right you go. And that, again, I think suggests that progress, by and large, the further you get on in the policy process cycle, is weaker perhaps than it is at the earlier stages of the cycle. And that's something I think we'll try and tease out of the conversation as we move forward. So that's just a kind of a diagrammatic representation, really, of the work that we've done. What we then did with all of this data is we've distilled it into a draft report that we're currently batting around between the team, where we've tried to kind of draft something that kind of gives an overview analysis of everything that we found. And that's what I'm going to present to you now, just some of the kind of insights from that report. So thinking about these results, thinking about what we found in the screening, if we come to the first criteria, policy frameworks and policy coherence, the criteria that we broke this down into, there were 5 of them. The framework for climate action from central government, i.e. from the metropolitan power, so from the UK or the Netherlands or France. The resilience plans and strategies that have been developed within the territory. The policy framework for mainstreaming. So how do you move from developing good climate planning and actually mainstreaming it through policy into policy and through into other areas of policy. What are the accountability mechanisms to make this happen? And to what extent has resilience been mainstreamed, or is it being mainstreamed in sectoral policies? And I think one thing to stress here is that it seemed quite obvious, and to reiterate a point I made earlier, that thinking about the time frame over which this happens is still really, really important. So it's quite striking that some territories seem to be making quite a lot of progress quite recently on some of these issues. I think that's quite an interesting thing to reflect on. So there have been bursts of activity over time, as I've already suggested, but some territories are doing quite a lot now. And I wonder whether if we were to repeat this activity in 3 or 4 years' time, whether we might get some different insights from it, because a lot of territories seem to be developing new plans and mainstreaming agendas almost in real time as we speak now. Anyway, the main overarching findings, I could go into a lot more detail on this, but I won't, are that all territories are developing plans and frameworks, but progress is uneven. Now, that might seem obvious, but progress is uneven. So some territories, and I think this came through actually in the Mentimeter activity, some territories have plans which are quite old now and quite dated. That might not mean that they lack any quality. It may be the case actually that was a big exercise when it was done, and there hasn't been a need to update it because it still kind of captures what's going on. Most territories have some kind of assessment of their climate or environmental kind of panorama, if you like. But as soon as you move on from kind of developing those initial kind of plans or developing those snapshot documents, the actual processes for mainstreaming policy, the kind of taking the analysis towards a kind of detailed plan that can be implemented or could be implemented through particular policy frameworks, things start to break down a little bit by and large. I mean, that's not always the case. Some territories have made significant progress in this area. But even where they have made progress, quite often the accountability mechanisms are weak. And what we really mean by an accountability mechanisms are the underpinning laws that are required to give effect to the policy. So a number of territories have really, really great plans, but they don't always have the necessary legislative frameworks to give effect to those plans. Or they do have legislative frameworks, but they're not specifically geared towards climate mainstreaming or adaptation. They're perhaps geared towards energy security or some other kind of environmental objective, which helps with parts of mainstreaming but isn't kind of a comprehensive climate mainstreaming endeavour. And there are tensions that sometimes exist between sectoral planning and resilience mainstreaming. So an obvious example here might be the tourism industry. In some territories, there's an obvious tension or trade-off between privileging the interests of tourism investors and also engaging in kind of protective activities, so protecting sensitive ecosystems and so on and so forth. So the broad finding is that all territories are doing lots of things here. Some are doing more than others, but the progress is very uneven, and there is limited accountability, even in the most successful territories, to actually push that mainstreaming process forward. But there are plenty of examples of strong practice that are distinct in their own ways. So I've singled out 3 territories here. I could have singled out others. What I'm not saying here is that it's only Bermuda, Montserrat and the Falklands that are doing well. It's just that from the screening that we did, it seemed to be that they were doing particularly well. So Bermuda is probably the territory that has the widest diversity of planning documents, kind of across the spectrum of its economy and society and environment. Bermuda's generated a huge number of plans. They're pretty advanced in terms of the kind of mechanisms that they conceive of. They have significant amounts of support as well, institutional support, bureaucratic support and expertise appended to them. But Montserrat has also done really, really well. So Montserrat obviously much smaller than Bermuda, has obvious constraints, partly that stem from the volcanic eruption a few decades ago, a more difficult environment to make policy in, I would imagine. But Montserrat has actually done a really great job of leveraging on the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, CANARI, which is based in Trinidad. And over the last couple of years, CANARI has published two really important environment plans and policy documents that are in draft format that are pretty comprehensive and really significant documents in terms of the kinds of things that they envisage. So even in a context of relatively limited capacity, Montserrat has done a great job generating those kinds of that kind of documentation. And then the Falklands as well has seemingly done a really good job at creating quite a wide-ranging set of frameworks to think about these kinds of issues. And I could talk more in detail about all of that. The report that we wrote on all of this was quite lengthy by the end. But broadly speaking, they're the big takeaways, and that leads to an evidence gap. It leads to a question, and one of them, and the evidence gap that I think is important here, is why are some territories making stronger progress than others? So again, I propose to pause at this point for a few minutes. Does anybody have any thoughts on what the answer to that question might be? Does anybody want to again chime in with experiences? Why are some territories making stronger progress than others? And I suppose, does the analysis I've outlined here, does that accord with your experience? Do you think that that's about right, what we've said, or are we wrong? Are we missing something? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Just to bear in mind too that some of these, some of them, like the Falklands, for example, has the advantage of a much more smaller population. So I think they're about 4,000 to 5,000 now. So if your island is not there, don't feel too bad, because it would be much easier to coordinate these kind of projects and programs and policies in a much smaller territory than it would be in a bigger one.
Yeah. Cheers, Courtney. I think Amy wants to come in. Amy, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm the outreach coordinator in the Turks and Caicos Islands. I think that regionally development is not equal. So where I'll cite Bermuda only because you did, but where we're only starting to catch up in comparison to an island nation that has been pretty well established. And we find our tourism product for economic prosperity is the main and sometimes the sole focus to ensure that livelihoods are improved. And so everything else takes a back seat to that, because, you know, the development we've seen in the last 10 years has been extreme, but and prior to that, you know, you go back 50 years ago and you know, there weren't any paved roads and that kind of thing. So I think there's a disparity with the rate of development is essentially what I'm saying. And I think as a result, there's a lot of catch up, and there's also it frustrates development and economic prosperity, because that catch up now has to take into consideration issues that weren't necessarily you know, prioritized 20, 30 years ago.
That's a really good point. So essentially what you're saying is that every territory is starting from a different place, aren't they? They have a different starting point that they're coming from.
Correct.
I wonder, yeah, and it seems to me as well, the challenges that they face are quite different in that sense, in terms of the institutional setting, in terms of the specific climate challenges they face and the capacity and so on. Fantastic. Does anybody else have any reflections on this question? Why are some territories making stronger progress than others? Okay, well, keep bearing that in mind. We can always come back to it. We'll move on to the next the next set of indicators. And we'll take two together here. So leadership and institutional capacity and coordination mechanisms. So for the first one, there were two criteria: the institutional structure to address climate change issues, and the second one was leadership. The leadership question was in some ways more difficult to answer because a number of the policy documents that we reviewed didn't really make it clear who actually has responsibility for leadership, and it wasn't kind of codified in some territories. It was almost kind of a de facto thing that people, locally probably just take at face value, but from the outside looking in, it wasn't obvious exactly how things function institutionally or structurally. But we came up with a number of findings here. So one of them is that the territories diverge quite dramatically in terms of the political capital invested and the timelines for progress. So again, this came through in the Mentimeter earlier. Political will is something that a number of you raised and thought was an issue. And it seems that potentially is a problem. That then raises another interesting question, which is, well, why does political will wane? Is it about changes in government? Is it about priorities of particular leaders? Is it about other pressing challenges that emerge? And one thing, again, that I think I suggested or hinted at earlier that was quite obvious from doing the screening is that there was a lot of activity taking place in the early to mid 2010s in a number of territories. And a lot of policies and plans that were developed during that period that were kind of adopted in draft, but have perhaps not made it to become finalized since, or if there were laws that were being developed or acts that were being developed, green papers and white papers, they didn't always make it onto the statute books as kind of legally codified things. So one of the things that an obvious reflection that came to my mind when doing the work was, well, to what extent did the pandemic affect some of this, possibly even the global financial crisis before it as well. But to what I think the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic must have been quite significant in terms of pushing a lot of environmental policy making onto the back burner as people grappled with other things. Because you do see this kind of drop off around about 2019 where things that were happening slow down a bit, and ever since around about 2021, 2022, things have started happening, it seems, in a number of territories. But there's huge divergence in terms of that political capital. It's quite obvious that certain territories produce reams of information and there's bursts of activity where they have a number of different policy documents and other things happening at key moments, and then at other times things seem to fade from view a little bit. The second kind of insight is that leadership also diverges, the nature of leadership and the kind of the institutions that are created, the structures that are created to harness that leadership between, as we kind of see it, there were two different ways of doing things within the territories. One is that some territories opt for what I've called here lean, non-duplicative mechanisms. And essentially what that means is that I think in certain territories, and this was certainly the case in the smaller British overseas territories, they essentially reproduce their existing disaster management committees, it seems to me. Or they have a very, very small kind of committee that is essentially composed of usually the governor and the premier, maybe the Minister of Environment, if that isn't also the premier, and maybe one or two other people if there's a kind of an executive leader of the disaster management organization or something like that. They'll tend to have these very, very lean structures that already exist in some other form, essentially, and they just reproduce that. And that seems to me a pretty sensible way to go, right? Certainly in terms of efficiency, because you can channel everything through that pre-existing institution. You don't have to generate new structures, and that in a small territory, that kind of very focused leadership can move things forward quite a significant pace. I suppose there's a counter argument to that though, which is that the danger is if there is a lack of political will, that institution can also become a bit of a brake on progress potentially, right? So things don't happen if that forward propulsion isn't emanating from that institution. So that's one way of doing things. The other way of doing things is a more diversified and complex kind of institutional setting, where you have a much wider paraphernalia of institutions, and you share out power and you share out the responsibility to lead. You sometimes even place it in completely independent institutions that sit independently of the political executive. And that obviously has its own advantages, right? Because you can have an organization that has its own legitimacy, that has its own ability to lead agendas, that isn't just purely subservient to the prevailing political mood. So there are two different ways of doing things. Examples of strong practice, again, these weren't the only ones, but they were ones that were quite striking. New Caledonia as a territory has a huge number of institutions relatively compared to other OCTs, driving forward these agendas, and it has a really complex mix of both kind of institutions that are metropolitan essentially, and also domestic local institutions. It's engaged in quite a significant process of institution building to lead forward environmental agendas, which gives it quite a lot of capacity. And the BVI as well, it seems the BVI is one of the countries that had a real burst of environmental policy making in the early 2010s, it seems, and in recent times has adopted quite a lot of significant and important plans and policies, that some of them are still in draft and they haven't yet fully materialized, but if you read them closely, they envisage the creation of some quite significant kind of coordination mechanisms and institutions to drive forward these agendas. So there are two examples of territories that have really moved forward on a lot of these kinds of issues. But that then leads to an evidence gap and a question that's unanswered, which is why do territories make very different choices in how to lead adaptation? Is this actually just about a question of size? Is small size and the nature of the relationship between the territory and the metropole the key explanation for the choices that they make in this regard? It may or may not be. But whatever the answer to that, I think that then highlights that the point we made earlier about needing a tool that is responsive and sensitive to the distinctive OCT context is really important. And that then leads into a conversation about coordination mechanisms, because not only does the institutional setup differ. Sorry?
Yeah. Just before you go into the coordination mechanism, I think Kimani made a very good point in the chat.
Oh, great.
Yeah, where she's saying, you know, some countries have a closer relationship with their EU member states, and she cited, you know, those countries aligned with the Netherlands as an example, the BES countries. So I think that ties well into your point about leadership and institutional capacity, because if you can draw more on, you know, the EU member state that you're aligned to and use their institutional capacity, then you would be better able to, you know, to handle things. So I don't know if they want to expand on that point a little bit, or even if you want to expand on it a little bit, but I thought it was something we could pull out to help illustrate point 2.
Yeah, well, let's definitely invite Kimani to come in on that, if you'd like to. Not meaning to put you on the spot, Kimani. Okay, well, no worries if not. I mean, I think that's a really, really good point. I mean, the BES islands are interesting, aren't they? Because they have their own distinctive, much closer relationship with the Netherlands than, or the Kingdom of the Netherlands than probably comparable OCTs, and certainly a different relationship to the other Dutch islands as well. Interestingly, probably a similar relationship to countries that are not OCTs but are much more integrated into the metropolitan power, like, you know, Martinique and Guadeloupe, the ultra-peripheral regions. So it's quite interesting, absolutely, the extent of their autonomy or the nature of where they fit within the kind of broader metropolitan structures is really, really significant. It's a great point. We'll come back to that question in a moment, because I think it's worth just painting the coordination mechanisms into this question of institutional capacity, because there's a lot of overlap here. And the main finding here was actually that it was difficult to find detailed information about existing mechanisms. much isn't published in small territories. So there are probably things that colleagues here know about that we were unable to find from the screening exercise. But even where we could find information about the existing mechanisms, so committees that have been set up, environmental planning committees and so on, it was unclear whether they were functioning, what the composition of them was, like who were the key members of them, and whether they were kind of deeply institutionalized or more sort of ad hoc in nature. You know, it's not like the minutes were published online or anything like that. And as I said earlier, the coordination activity was often, but not exclusively, undertaken from the central executive team. So again, this is an agenda that has often been pushed from the centre or not pushed from the centre, which comes back to that political will question. So strong practice here. Bermuda is a great example of a territory that has set up a quite significant set of kind of quasi-independent coordination mechanisms that drive forward a lot of its environmental agenda. It also is fortunate in that it has quite significant capacity, kind of non-governmental capacity, which is perhaps something I'll come back to in a moment. But Bermuda's got kind of across the whole spectrum of its environmental planning agenda. It's got quite a significant number of things going on. And at the top, there's quite a coherent set of committees that coordinate these agendas that can draw on quite substantial expertise to push them forward. So there's an evidence gap here, which is the question, I suppose, is how can we share lessons about leading adaptation in a context of resource constraint? And one of the lessons, I guess, from Bermuda is that they're fortunate in the sense that they have significant resources beyond just the government. So one of the things we kind of identify in the screening is that Bermuda as a territory is one of the largest insurance markets globally, the largest insurance market for catastrophe risk insurance. Now that doesn't perhaps directly connect to these climate mainstreaming activity, but indirectly what it means is that there is sizable human capital in Bermuda, people with expertise on environmental risk, on risk insurance, on environmental risk. So you have a lot of people working in Bermuda that have huge amounts of knowledge and capacity to undertake the kind of research and analysis that's required to push forward these kinds of agendas. And almost by osmosis, the government is able to kind of absorb that information. Those people are able to sit on committees, they're able to contribute to town hall meetings, they're able to help inform policy development strategies and so on. So all of that has like a kind of indirect spillover effect into the quality of environmental policy making that is able to happen on top of the sizable financial resources that the industry generates. Bermuda also has BIOS as well, which is the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences, I believe it stands for. So they have, it's essentially a kind of globally competitive university, marine university institute almost, so there's significant numbers of experts that work and orbit around BIOS. So the contribution that they can make in terms of expertise being fed into the environmental planning process and the development of strategies and so on is very, very obvious if you're on the outside looking in and reading these documents. So does anybody have any reflections on those two questions? Why do territories make different choices in how to lead adaptation? And how can we share lessons about this in a context of resource constraints?
Speaking of resource constraint, Eric made a very good point. So I don't know if you want to read that out, Mark.
Okay, let me just get the chat open.
Yes.
Okay, so Eric says that with Brexit, the UK OTs might have lost some funding opportunities, or being in a UK OT means that they're not eligible to access some funding sources like the World Bank. That's true, yeah. So, I mean, Brexit, I'll keep my personal views on Brexit to myself probably, but Brexit has certainly changed things. I mean, it's quite interesting though that the UK OTs are part of the GO Green Overseas Resilience Programme. And I think part of the thinking behind this programme is in part to kind of offset some of the barriers that have essentially been put up by Brexit, so retaining this kind of close linkage between the UK OTs and the European OCTs. But there's no question that the funding opportunities are much less than they once were. And I think that's right. The situation with kind of accessing concessional financing is a big problem. And this is a debate that's being had outside of non-sovereign small island territories by kind of SIDS, small island developing states as a whole. So there are some OTs that are eligible for concessional financing. So I think Montserrat is able to access some concessional financing from the UK. But it's not always the case that most are, because their GDP per capita is a bit too high. And Judrich says, similarly for the ABC Dutch OCTs, being part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands constrains the availability of funding in general. That's really interesting. So one thing that one would assume is actually that link makes funding more available rather than less. I don't suppose you'd be interested in coming in and explaining that, would you? Again, no pressure if you don't want to speak in front of everybody, Judrich.
Yes, hi. No, being part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands indeed is perhaps up to a certain extent a challenge to us, because we are being considered as, you know, having a high GDP, being quote unquote rich, while no one is looking at the vulnerability index of the islands. You know, that's something else. And basically that's it. And most of the time we are not part of any of those arrangements made. You know, the Netherlands is, but the islands are not. So for example, the Green Deal program of the EU, we are unable to tap into the funds just because of the reasons I just mentioned. And you know, there are many other funds similarly.
That's interesting. So that's a bit of a double-edged sword then, isn't it? So you're disadvantaged because you're in an integral part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, so essentially considered to be part of the Netherlands, but also then excluded from other mechanisms because of that.
Yes, because the constitutional arrangements, you know, it's because of that reason as well. I mean, what Kimani just mentioned, they are, you know, basically municipalities of the Dutch, of the Netherlands. And we as ABCs have totally different constitutional arrangements. We are autonomous within the kingdom. So it's, you know, sometimes it's even confusing to ourselves.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, does anybody else want to come in on these questions? Why territories make different choices and how we can share lessons? No? Okay, well, we can keep bearing these questions in mind. I'll come to the rest of the screening. I mean, the simple kind of story as we move further right on the diagram that I showed you earlier is that the information becomes a bit less and less evident. So on number 4 on climate information and tools, there were 2 criteria here: the extent of risk and vulnerability assessments, climate services, sorry, and there were 3, and knowledge transfer. We had one very straightforward finding here, which is that real-time cutting-edge data is limited in most territories, and they are by and large dependent on external information sources. Now, this isn't exclusively the case. Again, one of the examples of strong practice is Bermuda, and I mentioned BIOS just now. They've also undertaken quite significant and complex and sophisticated kind of coastal zone mapping and other complicated pieces of quite data-heavy research. But by and large, most of the territories don't have, you know, beyond a kind of local weather service, they don't have very extensive monitoring systems, in part because they're really expensive to develop. I presume the data kind of requirements are substantial and imply quite significant sunk costs. So the investments that you have to make in both the data gathering infrastructure and the kind of technologies that you need to maintain that data and render it usable and keep bringing it up to date is exceptionally expensive in a small territory where, you know, the sunk costs of that are just really, really significant. And as we say here, they're kind of dependent on external information sources. And sometimes those sources don't always gather the information that particular territories might want. So a number of the UK OTs, for example, in the Caribbean, are able to piggyback on kind of Caribbean, CARICOM organizations and other Caribbean regional organizations, but they don't always necessarily gather the data for those specific territories that they might want. So other examples of strong practice beyond Bermuda, well, the French Southern and Antarctic lands actually have huge amounts of monitoring data. And I think that's quite interesting. It tells us something intriguing about the nature of those territories. So they don't have like permanent populations. The people who tend to spend time there are scientists who come from other places, and as a consequence of that, the actual monitoring that they have is quite significant, and the data sources that they have are quite significant. But beyond that, we could find relatively little data about the climate information and tools that territories have at their disposal. And I think there's something quite interesting here, which is that part of the sort of effect of that is that this then plays out in the kinds of planning that they're able to do. So some territories are able, or many territories, as I said earlier, are able to generate quite detailed environmental plans, but they find it much more difficult to create, you know, quite detailed data-driven kind of mapping and those sorts of things. So I suppose this leads to another evidence gap, which is why climate risk assessment is so patchy. What data do we need, and how can it inform policy? So how can we not only get the right data, but make it usable so that it can inform the kinds of assessments that are required to then feed into the policy process? And then the fifth one, and you can see that the text is getting less and less for each of the criteria, supportive human and financial resources. So the main finding here was quite simply that it was almost impossible to find useful data on this criterion. Some examples of strong practice, potentially Anguilla. So Anguilla is very small and has relatively limited capacity in the kind of conventional sense, but has actually done quite a lot to consolidate a sense of kind of its climate challenge and the kind of adaptation needs that it has. And St. Bart has also done quite a significant amount of work. So there's been some work done in St. Bart to identify some of the resilience investments that are required and how they might be mobilized. And there's actually quite significant financial capacity in St. Bart. It's quite a wealthy island. On the other hand, though, the environmental ministry there is very, very small. There's only 7 people working, engaging in the technical work that's required to give effect to this in policy terms. But beyond that, it was very, very difficult for us to find published information on this topic. So the evidence gap here is a simple question. Is our apparent lack of evidence a true reflection of reality? So I won't linger on those questions, but please feel free to put something in the chat if you want to. I'll move on to the final slide of the presentation. And again, you know, the evidence becomes more and more patchy the further into these criteria we get. So number 6 was stakeholder engagement, participation and inclusivity. There are 2 main criteria here: participation and inclusivity themselves, and awareness raising. And the main finding here was that most territories in their planning documents or policies talk about engagement, they talk about participation and inclusivity, they talk about consultation. But much of the language around this is quite aspirational and rhetorical. So there's a lot of talk about the need to bring in different communities, whether they be youth or whether they be coastal communities or fisher folk or whoever it might be, into the process. But it's not clear whether that necessarily leads to meaningful participation. The participation that occurs is kind of sporadic and limited. And because the language is so aspirational, it's often talking about generating forms of participation that haven't yet happened. But one example of strong practice was French Polynesia, which has recently engaged in a really widespread process of consultation to develop some of its environmental climate change planning documents. And not only that, the process of engagement has led to the establishment, or the proposed establishment, of a whole series of meaningful kind of stakeholder committees that will have a kind of constitutionally mandated role, if you like, in the implementation of those agendas. So if that comes to fruition and occurs and is implemented successfully, this could ultimately be a really good case study of successful participation. I could also put the BVI here as well. From some of the documents, it seems that the BVI has done a really good job of engaging the population in kind of stakeholder activities to try and inform the policy planning process in recent times, although the extent to which that will lead to kind of meaningful ongoing participation, like kind of institutionalized participation, we're less sure about from the available information. But again, this would be something that would be great to get some feedback and insights from yourselves. So the evidence gap here is a simple one. How is it possible to generate greater bottom-up participation in adaptation governance? And we use the word bottom-up quite deliberately here because kind of the sort of at least the academic debate on this subject emphasizes the importance of bringing people into the process as participants, as subjects, as people who get to shape the process, rather than just kind of objects, people who are kind of consulted at the end of the process to ask if they're happy with it. It can lead to much better policy making because people are included, people who really understand the way things function on the front line and who have to live with the consequences of policy. And then finally, we get to M&E. This was unquestionably the weakest area of the screening. Now, one might say, is that because the implementation process in most places has not proceeded very far? So by definition, maybe the monitoring and evaluation process hasn't started. But then if we consider the process as a cyclical thing, we call it the policy process cycle. It's a cyclical thing, which means that M&E is something that could and should occur at every single stage. So we should be constantly evaluating and monitoring how well we're doing, in part because, as I said at the very beginning, climate is changing and we need to adapt continually. So if we need to adapt continually, we need to keep monitoring that adaptive process. So it needs to be an active form of monitoring of adaptation. So the evidence gap here is the extent to which you have monitoring and evaluation systems for other policies and issues. Can they be applied to this adaptation process? Can they be, can they inform it? How can setting up a monitoring and evaluation system help to circulate information and raise awareness? So over the last couple of slides, we've kind of had 4 questions here. Why are climate risk assessments so patchy? What data do we need? Is our lack of evidence on the extent of supportive human and financial resources a real reflection of reality? How is it possible to generate greater bottom-up participation in adaptation governance? And do you have a monitoring and evaluation system set up, or how can you set one up for this issue? Does anybody have any reflections on any of those? And if not, there are a set of other questions, kind of broad questions that we've posed here for people to think about. Does the screening appear accurate broadly to you as I've presented it here? Obviously, there's a lot more detail in the report. What might we have missed? What new initiatives are taking place in your territory? And are there examples of strong practice that we should know about? Drexel.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to just say a little bit on the stakeholders engagement, at least from the perspective of BVI. So, planning process is mandated in there. So once you have a project of a certain magnitude or something that's going to affect the community, it's mandated that you have to have at least two community meetings. And so, and I mentioned that because it's part of, I guess it's ingrained in the society that we are going to be engaging with the community. And so I think that has extended to the persons doing, leading the climate change initiatives too, because it begins to get, it's a buzz. And, we have, again, the personnel over there, they really, whether they tie it to the planning process or they just lean from the experiences through the planning process to allow for the stakeholder engagements and to ensure that that happens. So it has become you know, ingrained in the society that this will happen. And so I think that's one of the things that we latch on to, that we are able to have some successes.
Yeah, I think that you definitely get that sense from reading these documents that BVI has done a really good job of doing this. Like, it is something that seems to be second nature. Does anybody else want to come in on any of those questions, or indeed the four that I've just flashed up onto the screen? We're particularly interested to know if there are things that we've missed, or if there are things happening in your territories that we should know about. Eric, sure.
Can I briefly share our plans? We approached the Caribbean Development Bank. TCI is not a member. We are an associate member of the Caribbean Development Bank, and they agreed to support us in at least, wait, I'm trying to find the document, in at least 4 areas. And I will briefly read the 4 areas. They want to support us in legislation, policy, laws, and regulation. And I'm referring to the renewable energy and energy efficiency. The renewable energy is finished. The energy efficiency is in the draft form. Actually, the EU RESMBID contributed a lot in collecting some information about energy efficiency. The second area that they want us to discuss with them, we'll meet them next week in Miami, is electrification of the transportation system. So we want to discuss how they will help us, because in Turks and Caicos, we don't have an established, unorganized public transport system. So if you don't have a car, it's really difficult to move around in Turks and Caicos. The third area is the offshore wind. We received a budget from EUGO on the feasibility study of offshore wind, but Caribbean Development Bank wanted to go further into details. They want to install a LiDAR in the area identified by the EUGO, collect accurate data, so that they said it will be a bankable project. And the fourth area that they want us to support, there's no decision yet, but they said they're interested to support us, is the pilot testing of agrivoltaic. This just like the ordinary ground mount PV system, but the only difference is it will be elevated in a higher position, and the solar modules will be spaced a little bit wider to allow the sunlight to penetrate into the ground so that we can grow agricultural crops beneath the solar system. So we are producing agricultural crops and at the same time generating power in the solar PV. Thank you.
Fantastic. That's great. Anybody else? Okay, well, please keep pondering the questions that we've posed here. We're very interested to get your feedback as we go forward. The final part of the session now is a very brief introduction to the quick governance tool that colleagues at Ramboll have been designing. And essentially what I'm going to do is just very briefly talk you through it. And if anybody has any questions about it, I'll invite Leticia to come in and talk about it in a bit more detail. So essentially the purpose of the quick governance scan tool is to help you to be able to assess the level of progress towards resilience mainstreaming in your territory, and to deploy it in your kind of everyday activities to try and see
proceeding. So the tool is kind of based on all of the things that we've already talked about today. It's kind of based on the same principles and the same structural principles as the different elements of the policy process that we've talked through. It has 4 dimensions that you can see here, thinking about the kind of objectives of mainstreaming, so i.e. assessing the level of institutional preparedness and capacity, identifying the barriers and the levers for mainstreaming climate change resilience for a specific institution or sector. So i.e. thinking through exactly what the context is like, thinking about getting a sense of, you know, where the opportunities might be and where the things that are preventing them from being carried out are. Then it looks at the target of any change. So how do you actually, you know, who do you target in order to be able to generate change? Who will find this useful? So the decision makers here are decision makers, practitioners, i.e. policy officers, project managers from institutions and public administrations in charge of climate change resilience across all sectors. So that is a good description of everybody on this call, pretty much, I think. What is it? What's the output? Well, this is an online tool, as I said just now, for self-assessing and visualizing the barriers and associated levers for mainstreaming. So, you know, again, what are the things preventing mainstreaming from happening, and what are the levers you can pull to try and overcome them? And the kind of outcome of it is that the person using it will be able to understand what are the key components for resilience mainstreaming in a given sector, and how can you identify those barriers that are preventing it and enhance the kind of mainstreaming process to overcome those barriers. So this is a quick tool that will allow you to very, very quickly get a sense of the context and how you should navigate and proceed forward in that context. So essentially, it, as the slide says here, is a framework that aims to provide step-by-step guidance on how to identify those barriers and thereby help to mainstream resilience into legislation and policies. So it allows people or teams within different services and departments of whatever institution it may be to self-assess how well resilience is integrated into their policies. And it provides a starting point for further reflection on integrating resilience throughout the policy development cycle. So essentially, by using this tool across all of the OCTs, it will hopefully provide an insight into the overall performance of resilience mainstreaming in the territories and allow for kind of cross-cutting and comparative analysis. So in that sense, it performs kind of a learning function as well. In, you know, we've already done a stock take and a synthesis of the existing published data. This will be a kind of more empirical thing that will allow for the generation of yet more data to get a more finely grained and kind of nuanced sense of exactly what the barriers are and how people are seeking to overcome them. The way it functions is that it is an instrument where the user is invited to answer a series of questions across the adaptation process based upon the 7 components that I've talked about just now, for each of those core levers that can support resilience mainstreaming. So it helps to essentially guide the level of progress towards that objective. Guidance is provided through using the tool and to help the user find the necessary information to answer the questions that they want to answer. So the online tool is under development at the moment. You can see a kind of snapshot of what the interface is going to look like. And when going into the tool, you can see on the top right of this diagram, we've got the kind of framework that I've already presented tonight. And that informs the different steps along the tool. So people will have an opportunity to answer a whole series of questions that kind of get progressively more sort of nuanced and finely grained in order to be able to generate the necessary data to understand barriers and also levers. So these questions correspond to every stage of the planning, implementation and monitoring cycle, and they correspond to each of the 7 core levers that support resilience mainstreaming, as I've already said. So in this green box at the bottom, you'll get some guidance, which will help you find the information you require to fill it in. And then there'll be a kind of scale to select the answer, so we can get a kind of quantitative assessment of what's going on in different territories. And then coming out of that, there's an example visualization there on the right-hand side. The scoring will give a kind of overview snapshot of the level of advancement of resilience mainstreaming in the context and the kind of main barriers. But the QGS tool will also provide resources and recommendations to help support the user in then identifying ways to overcome the barriers and prioritize particular courses of action or prioritize things that should be reflected upon within the teams in which they work. It's going to be finalized over the next few months by the team, and it will form a key part of the training workshop that's due to take place in mid-October in Brussels. So this will take place, we think, from the 14th to the 16th of October. So it will be a kind of key output of the whole project, and it will be something that will be a key focus of the training when it occurs. So I've put some questions up here. If people have any thoughts on it, what is your initial reaction to the tool? Does it seem useful? Is there anything that could be added? Can you think of ways that you might adopt and apply it in your own work to assess the different components of mainstreaming? And are there things, i.e. resources, documentation, guidance, that would be useful for you to inform your use of the tool? These might not be questions that people feel they can answer just yet, but they're questions that are certainly on the team's mind as they develop this. I don't know if Leticia, you want to come in and say anything at this point about the tool that I may have missed.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Hi, everyone. No, just to say, I think today what we want to do is really to present you a very first, very preliminary structure of the tool. Of course, it's still under development, and the training sessions we're having now and the screening process we conducted is feeding into the development of the tool, especially to identify what are the key questions really that will help you through like identifying, as Matt said, the main barriers you could face in this mainstreaming process, and because the idea is to develop a tool that would be really useful to you and provide you with recommendations, operational recommendations and resources you could then use to help you through this process. So you will probably hear from us soon, and we'll probably consult you and ask your feedback during the process of developing this tool.
That's great. Thanks, Leticia. So David Northcott from Bermuda says that it looks promising. That's very, very good to know. Would be useful to have access to a database of documents that you compiled from across the OCETs and or the spreadsheet you showed earlier. Yeah, so we can talk about that as a team and work out the best way to share all of the information. At the minute, all of the reports and whatnot that we've got are a bit disparate, but I'm sure we can consolidate them into something useful that we can share with people, for sure. Does anybody else want to come in with any comments or thoughts?
Just before we go, Matt, I just that idea that came out at the start in the Mentimeter, that there are people in these territories that are not convinced about climate change. I think that would be a good thing to really zone in on, to identify why. I think it's very, very interesting. One of the things I noticed while doing the screening was the effort these islands are putting into mitigation. And I'm always surprised by this, because small island developing countries, their level of emission is negligible combined. And that's just in the non-OCTs. It's about 0.2% contribution to carbon emissions. So you have to wonder, well, what are you trying to mitigate? But then I guess the idea is that, you know, when you wean off of fossil fuel, then there's less of an input bill for these countries. So identifying what, you know, these countries aren't convinced about, I think is really something interesting to delve into. And how does that factor in? Because these countries don't have two-party parliamentary systems, I would imagine. Maybe they do, I'm not sure. But is this debate taking place at the community level where some people are not convinced, or is it taking place at the governmental level where you can't put in place policies because some policymakers, parliamentarians, it maybe are not convinced while others are? And so you have a policy issue right there where you really can't go forward. Or is it that there's a lack of policy continuity where policies are put in place by some governments and then reversed at the next election?
Yeah.
So I think this is an interesting point to really go further into.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to get
Yeah.
people's thoughts on for sure. Okay, well, we're almost out of time. So we'll just move on toward the end of the session now. So this was the second of 5 sessions. The third session will be much more interactive than the ones so far. We've got some quite interesting activities for everybody to do collectively. And this will be focused on building a community around climate resilience. So how do we go about identifying the right stakeholders? And then the final thing just to say is, well, thank you very much for attending. If you go to this link, it will take you to the Green Overseas platform. And if you register for that and log in, you'll find a whole host of useful resources and interesting things that should be useful in there. So please do feel free to take the time to do that. And let me just say thanks to everybody for attending, and really look forward to seeing you all again next week. And if any of you have any thoughts afterwards about any of the questions that we've raised today, feel free to just send us a message to think about. And we'll look into how we can go about sharing some of the insights that we've generated in a more usable form for everybody. Thank you very much.